Delighted to welcome you to the penultimate lecture in our series on Asian diasporas. I can see from our audience that the Pomona diaspora has already begun to take place. Tomorrow is the last day of the semester before spring break. So it's the Thursday evening when I'm sure some students are already on the road or at the airport cutting class tomorrow or something. But we are very delighted that we have some very special guests here tonight. I understand we have former deans of the college, President Oxtoby is here, and several good friends of the Institute as well as from the community. And I'm really delighted that you could be here to hear Professor Jurgensmeyer. This is a real treat to bring him here. He's been here 12 years ago. We just took a tour of the campus. He's quite impressed to see the changes here. But also, I think more importantly, he really reaches the pulse of one of the issues, touches the pulse of the issues of the Asian diasporic experience that we have not touched on in this series. And that is the political dimension of the politics of culture and the issues of terrorism. And Professor Jurgensmeyer, as a specialist, particularly on religious ideologies, earlier Hinduism, also training in theology, has a special perspective on this issue. He's interviewed many of the major figures that have played on the political scene, both in Asia and in Europe. And I really am delighted that we can begin to focus our series onto contemporary political events. As you know, our last speaker dealt with an Asian diasporic experience, the journeys of Zhenghe, which took place 400 years ago. And this brings us more up to date. I should mention that in 2 weeks, we will also have another speaker that's been added to our program. So I want to mention that Professor Frank de Cutter from SOAS, University of London, will be here, and he'll be dealing with the issue of opium in China and the opium trade, which is a different kind of diaspora of materials which are still spreading, both historically as well as contemporary drug politics in China, Southeast Asia, and throughout both the southern and the northern Silk Roads. And then finally, our last speaker in our series is Karen Yamashita, who will be talking about the Asian diaspora here, both through literature and novels, has done research on Brazilian Japanese in the LA area, Japanese community, as well as back in Japan. And I should mention that our film series will start on March 22nd with the film Canadian-Chinese filmmaker titled Eve and the Fire Horse. And this is a wonderful film that combines, from the eyes of a child, the interaction between Buddhism and Christianity through a 12-year-old Chinese-Canadian. And I think you will be delighted to see that film. And it really, I think, it gives evidence of our concern at Pomona College and Pacific Basin Institute to not only bring the issues of Asia here to Pomona, but also to try to bring our students and our community more exposure to what is confronting Asians themselves in the experience of movement, of migration, and the politics and the dilemma of being often caught between countries and cultures. So without further delay, I will welcome Professor Mark Jurgensmeyer.
Thank you. Thank you, Drew. Thanks. Thank you, Drew, and it's a pleasure to be here at Pomona. My remarks this afternoon will be based on research that I've done for this project here in the Mind of God that came out several years ago. And in fact, research I've done in the area of religious violence for the last 20 or so years. This book now has been translated into Chinese, Japanese, Indonesian, as well as most European languages. And the book I'm working on now is called, I have to think because we just thought of a title for it. It's called Global Rebellion on the rise, the encounter of religious activism in the secular state, which should be out later this year. And then a series of lectures I gave at Princeton this last year will be published as a book on religion and war. I'm going to touch on many of these themes in my comments today and try to weave them into the general general subject of the relationship of the diaspora communities to the rise of religious violence around the Pacific Basin. Now, for the purpose of this conversation, I'm going to include India as a part of the Pacific Basin. Yeah, it's a kind of stretch, I know, but it's where I started this whole project. I lived in the Punjab in North India for a number of years. I associated with the Sikhs, whom I regarded and still regard as just wonderfully gracious and lively, open, interesting people. And then to see the spiral of violence that developed in the Punjab in the 1980s between the Sikh activists, the supporters of the Khalistani movement, and the Indian government supported by this man, Sant Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale. It was really an extraordinary thing, and I wanted to know why. Why was this happening? And more importantly to me, someone who studied religion and politics all of my life, what did religion have to do with it? And why is this happening now? And the insights that I developed out of following the speeches and the comments of Sant Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale to try to get inside of the mind of people who were involved in that movement propelled me in a project that I'm working on to this day, to try to get into the mindset of those involved in religious violence and this extraordinary competition and contestation between religious politics and the secular state. In the case of Bhindranwale, it all came to a head in 1984 at the site of the Golden Temple, where the Akal Takht, this headquarters of the Sikh religious organization, in the precincts of this lovely, beautiful shrine of the Golden Temple. Bhindranwale had holed himself up, Indira Gandhi, trying to think what should she possibly do, what kind of way out there could be in this confrontation. Decided to invade the Golden Temple in the middle of the night. It was a kind of bungled military maneuver. You should never listen to your generals when they tell you, don't worry, Indira, we've got a plan. Because things always go a little wrong. In this case, a lot wrong. And the Hanks couldn't get into the precincts of the Golden Temple. The militants sneaked in materials and armament from the outside. There was a huge, huge confrontation. Thousands of, probably in many cases, innocent pilgrims who had come to the Golden Temple on pilgrimage were killed. And later in that year, Mrs. Gandhi herself was targeted for assassination by her own Sikh bodyguards as she walked between her office and the gardens, her home and her office and the gardens of her lovely residence in New Delhi. They pulled out automatic weapons and shot her and left her bleeding and dying on the garden path. So how could this have happened? This is where I entered the discussion. And what does this broader diaspora community have to do with it? Now, in this case, and this is one of the reasons why I began with this case, quite a bit, interestingly, the very idea of a Khalistan was hatched up by Punjabis, not in the Punjab, but abroad in London. They thought up the idea of a great state. The great activism for the movement really came originally out of the UK rather than out of the Punjab. It was in the UK that a first passport for Khalistan was created. This currency, this money, Khalistan rupees, were created and printed up. And much of the money for the movement came from Sikhs abroad, including California. A large number of California Sikhs were involved in supporting what they saw was a movement for Sikh honor and prestige and identity. Now, in this particular case, these are Sikhs who are rallying after 2001 in order to show their loyalty to the American government, the fact that they were not terrorists, and they certainly weren't involved in 2001, even though they were Sikhs because of their turbans, beards, and the kind of stupidity of Americans who thought, oh, anybody with turbans and beards must be those awful Muslims who are trying to destroy us, killed a number of Sikhs in those terrible weeks after 2001. And they're trying to identify with America's values and show that they're not a part of that. And yet there were, as I said in an earlier moment, Sikhs who did support this Khalistani movement back in the Punjab. So there are global connections to the rise of religious violence in different parts of the world. Japan, of course, is much more in the Pacific Basin. And it was in Japan that one of the most curious and horrific acts of religious terrorism occurred in the last 10 or 15 years. And that was a funny little movement, the Aum Shinrikyo, led by Master Shoko Asahara. Master Shoko Asahara was, in many ways, like many religious leaders in the new religious movements in Tokyo and elsewhere in Japan, who prophesied a kind of a religion beyond the traditional religions, a religion that would enfold all of Buddhist beliefs within its encompass. In fact, it moved out beyond Buddhism and embraced even aspects of Hinduism, ideas from Shaivism. And although it's remembered because of the horrific act that culminated the movement's existence and brought Shoko Asahara himself into the attention of the Tokyo police, he was then arrested, convicted. He's now awaiting execution. Still attempts, as you know, the Japanese legal system works very slowly, but it is part of the nerve gas, relief of the nerve gas for the Tokyo subway. But for most of the Aum Shinrikyo's history, it was remembered as a slightly kooky but intense yoga movement. It taught different types of interior, get in touch with one's interior self, a kind of trying to elevate the interior spirit, and in fact, more than that, physically, to actually levitate the body during these acts of, there are little movies which show people kind of hopping as they're cross-legged, and one is to imagine them actually levitating for a few moments before they come crashing down, so high is their spiritual life. Master Asahara himself was partly blind. He was led around from place to place, sort of adding to his aura of internal mystique. When I showed up in Tokyo a couple months after the nerve gas incident, wanting to understand more about it and interview members of the movement, they were deliriously happy to see me. I followed members. This is a place near Shinjuku, their bookstore, and they sold various little artifacts, clothing, T-shirts, saris, videotapes of the master. They seemed to be extremely happy to see me, and professed faith in Master Asahara's teachings. And what they said about that incident with the nerve gas, they didn't know whether he was implicated or not. But they said that when they heard about this incident, they knew that Master Asahara's prophecies had come to fulfillment. For them, these prophecies that there was a great war coming, a great apocalyptic World War III, a great confrontation, an evil war, a battle between good and evil, and religion and irreligion, and right and wrong. This great confrontation that was talked about in the book of Revelation in the New Testament, he imagined within Buddhist framework of reference that occur in Japan. And just like World War II had obliterated many cities in Japan, this World War III would be even more catastrophic. And when the Great War came, he said, nothing would be able to protect you. Not even the deepest spot in all of Tokyo would be able to protect you from the release of sarin gas. And so that was the reason why in this laboratory near Mount Fuji they were experimenting with sarin gas, not, as he explained to his members, to use it, of course, themselves, of course not, but rather in order to develop defenses, a kind of protection, because when the great warfare came, there would be nuclear attacks, there would be poisonous gas attacks, and his people had to be protected. You had to, if you wanted to escape from Armageddon, you had to join Aum Shinrikyo. So when in fact, as 6 trains were converging from different parts of Tokyo, heading towards Kasumi Kaseki Station in the center of Tokyo near the Ginza. And on these 6 trains, as they were all headed towards that one central stop in Tokyo, which happened to be, by the way, the deepest subway stop in all of Tokyo. It's a nuclear protection area. If there's ever a nuclear drill, people would be asked to come to Kasumi Kaseki Station. It's the deepest. In fact, one of his prophecies, Shoko Asahara has said, not only in this very stop, Kasumi Kaseki stop, the safest place in Tokyo, will you be safe once Armageddon comes. Just so happened that on trains headed for this very stop, there was in fact sarin gas, contained in liquid form in a plastic bag, put in a paper sack. And the very last stop, as the trains were heading for Kasumi-Kaseki Station, the people who brought the paper sacks, many of them with MAs, PhD degrees, from distinguished Waseda, other distinguished universities in Japan and the United States, members of the Aum Shinrikyo, they would leave the bags there. They carried with them umbrellas with sharpened pointed tips. So as the little sacks were left on the station, right before the last train was to go to the last car was about to go to the station, they would leave that sack there. They would, as they were jumping off the train, puncture the sack with their umbrella, leap off the train as the doors would close, and the trains rumbled on towards Kasumi-Kaseki as the gas began to leak out of the sack and began to permeate the cars. And soon people would be coughing, spitting up blood, clutching their sides. A dozen people were killed in the spot. Hundreds were injured. Thousands could have been killed if a pure form of sarin gas had been used rather than the diluted form that in fact they used. And the people I talked with said, "You see, Master Asahar was right. The Great War is coming. Armageddon is at hand. We were almost attacked. The sarin gas, he said, would be used in World War III, in fact, was used." It was, in a sense, a massive advertisement for Aum Shinrikyo, fulfillment of the prophecies that great war is at hand. And of course, as it turned out, members of the Omen movements were involved in perpetrating that act that gave the illusion of the beginning of the Great War. But still, members of the movement, now having changed their name to Aleph, continue to believe that these prophecies are substantially true. Now, one of the interesting things as the investigation about Aum Shinrikyo began to unfold was that it was not just a Japanese movement. They had connections around the world. There were Japanese and other expatriate Japanese in other parts of the world who were supporters of the movement. They, in fact, were part of a larger kind of global constituency. This is the Aum Shinrikyo meeting in Russia, for example. A large number of Russians, in fact, high-placed government officials in Russia were also members of the Aum Shinrikyo and were brought into this vision of an apocalyptic war and the need for Aum Shinrikyo to be that haven, that safe spiritual haven, not just for the recesses of one's own spiritual journey, but for a physical protection in time of warfare. Well, of course, global Islam carries with it in many parts of the world also images of great conflict, great contestation. And this is true not only in the Middle East, but in parts of Asia as well, not only in South Asia, where localized groups as the Taliban are trying to create a religious nationalist state, but in places like Indonesia, where Bashir and others associated with the Jamaat-e-Islamiyah have been implicated in the hideous bombings of nightclubs and hotels in Bali, hotels in Jakarta, other attacks within Indonesia, not only to discredit the secular government of Indonesia, but also as a part of what they imagine to be a kind of global jihad, a global response to westernization. And the targets are interestingly chosen, not specifically government buildings, not clearly against only the secular government in Indonesia, although meant in part to discredit them, but more importantly to bring to light a kind of fundamental critique of the influence of Western culture in many parts of the world, and especially in places like Bali or downtown Jakarta, where to be a part of the nightlife and the glamour and glitter there is to partake even for a moment in the allure of, say, Southern California, and the other images of modernity that one sees as the ubiquitous media that we're all confronted with. One could argue that in the Philippines some of the same is true, though of course part of the conflict in the Philippines is with the Moros in the south, the Muslim kind of separatist movement that's been going on for decades. But yet more recently in Manila there are activist Islamic movements, and many of them connected with these sort of global jihadis. Sheikh Khalid Mohammed, for example, for a time was in Manila, along with Ramzi Youssef, who is his nephew, who was involved in a plot, the Bojinka plot, that was going to bomb American airplanes as they flew across the Pacific. Now you can say, what a ridiculous idea, and they were ultimately found out, and the plot was disrupted. But is it sheer coincidence that Ramzi Youssef himself and Sheikh Khalid Mohammed were also implicated in the planning of 2001, September 11th, which also involved airplanes hijacked, in this case not blown up over the Pacific, but slammed into the towers of the World Trade Center in New York City and in the Pentagon? A plot that you can argue began in Southeast Asia. It began as a part of the global jihadi network in Manila in the earlier Bojinka plot. It was a connection that has concerned officials in Indonesia, the Philippines, also in Malaysia, where similar groups have been found in Kuala Lumpur, in Singapore, where an attack on Singapore buildings was disrupted, again a part of this larger global jihadi network that combines both activists from Southeast Asia and the kind of global jihadis from Pakistan and Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Sudan who have been involved in some of these other more ambitious kinds of projects. But again, there are also local issues. In Patani province, southern Thailand, right along the Malay-Thai border, for example, to this day, there is conflict between local Muslim groups who regard themselves as Malay and Thai Buddhist groups, a conflict that has both local concerns over territory and territorial control, but also it's laced with a kind of global jihadi identity. One of my graduate students who's in Singapore this year, who's studying the conflict, who's been trying to interview both Buddhists and Muslims in this region, has discovered that the very fact that he's an American brands him as a part of the enemy from the point of view of the Muslim activists who don't see this as purely a local battle in southern Thailand between Malay Muslims and Thai Buddhists, but rather see the forces of secular Westernism behind the Thai government, who see kind of global jihad behind their own activism. And so this local movement is then framed within this larger global contestation. It seems that an era of globalization, it's not just economics, it's not just cultural issues that seem to be ubiquitous and everywhere, but it's also political activism and religious ideology, that local issues are no longer ever quite local. They are touched with ideologies that are transnational, that move beyond national borders, and it often involves a network of support that's transnational, either through global activists or through expatriate communities of support. And we shouldn't leave out China either. Of course, have Falun Gong as one example, not that it's violent, but certainly the Chinese government has responded to it as if it might be. And of course, as you know, it is an international network of community as a part of the support for the Falun Gong. And one can argue that the Chinese Muslims, who have their own griefs against the Chinese government, also have an international constituency. I'm not going to say anything more about that since we have the world's greatest authority on Chinese Muslims in the world. And Drew, if I've already said something foolish or stupid, I'm sure you'll correct me. I have to tell you that one of my first introductions to Drew many years ago was an occasion in which he took me to, and I didn't even know such things existed, a Chinese Muslim restaurant in Monterey Park. There were 2 of them. Maybe now there are even more. There are now 5? My Lord. But for me, it was quite an eye-opener, as at the time kind of had the normal assumption that Islam was a relatively minor part of Chinese culture, and I didn't realize the degree to which, particularly in Western China, it's a significant cultural feature indeed. But wherever there are cultural differences in the contemporary world, there is this globalized context of ideological confrontation and diasporic connections that complicates any local conflict that used to be perceived in a more localized terms. In Europe, of course, this is dramatically illustrated with issues that seem to befuddle people in, for example, the city of Copenhagen, where I'll be going next week, in part to talk about this very issue, where the protection of the right to have cartoons, even silly, foolish, dumb cartoons about anything, seems to be so fundamental to Enlightenment values, and yet so anathema, so antithetical to Islamic values that perceive, at least in some quarters, these kind of caricatures to be a deep insult to Islam itself, and one more indication of something that really is quite true. And that is the marginalization of the Muslim community within Northern Europe in particular, but Europe in general. I taught in Lund in Sweden a year ago summer and was shocked to discover that there are no mosques in Copenhagen. They're not allowed to build a mosque. So many of them lived in Sweden, in Malmo, went back and forth across the bridge in order to take part in their economic activities. No Muslim graveyard is allowed in Copenhagen. You get the picture. There's this sense of the marginalization of the community, which these cartoon caricatures then simply ignite a resentment, a kind of sense of frustration and humiliation that the community has collectively felt. And of course, the same sort of thing happened in Amsterdam and resulted in the tragic murder of Theo van Gogh. So there is violence in every part of the Pacific Rim, and oh yes, did I mention the United States. We are, after all, a part of the Pacific Rim, and we sometimes forget that the largest terrorist attack on American soil before 9/11 was the Oklahoma City bombing. And it wasn't, as many people first thought when they saw this hideous scene of the destruction of Oklahoma City, an act of a Muslim wacko. It was a Christian wacko. And yeah, I know that Timothy McVeigh is often portrayed as a lone wolf who simply had some peculiar and unknown reason for hating the American government. But what usually isn't described is his deep connection with a broad subculture of Christian religious activism, a Christian militia. A lot of it associated with the Christian identity movement. Timothy McVeigh loved the Turner Diaries. It was and the belief of cosmotheism advocated by William Pierce, its author, who thought that America was being held grip by a liberal extremist who was letting America drift into a new world order of kind of global homogenization that would remove the kind of racial distinctiveness of America and its Christian heritage, and so as to recreate this Christendom that Timothy McVeigh was involved in this act that he thought, in a scenario directly out of the Turner Diaries, would create a revolution in the United States. And suddenly people would realize that there's a war going on, a battle between good and evil and right and wrong and religion and irreligion, and that the American government is a part of the cruel enemy. I interviewed a Lutheran pastor in the United States who had bombed abortion clinics and up and down the East Coast, and his argument was that not just that abortion was wrong, but that America was in the grip of a kind of globalized new world order that failed to see its Christian roots, and he wanted to do away with the Constitution and replace it with the Bible as the basis of law. And he thought that maybe you could go state by state, start with, like Mississippi or one of the Dakotas, began to convert American culture back to a true Christendom. So it's this underlying sense of Christianity under attack. One of his best friends, Reverend David Hill, in Pensacola, Florida, took out a gun as two staff members were going into a clinic that performed abortions, shot them, killed them. And as they lay dying, he threw down his gun and he said to the policemen who were looking startled because the clinic was heavily guarded, he said, "Arrest me." And of course they immediately did, and he must have known that they would take him to prison, that he would be tried and convicted for murder and then executed, which he was last year by the state of Florida. Is he a Christian suicide attacker? See an example of a Christian terrorist who thinks that God is on his side in the great war between good and evil. He's willing to give his life for the cause. Depends on how you define it, I suppose. But in this particular case, the Diaspora Connections, which is a part of a sub-theme of the lectures this term, the Diaspora Connection is, in a sense, the fear of diaspora, the fear of new communities, the fear of a new kind of cultural heterogeneity within American culture, and the attempt to try to, in their perverted way of thinking, to shore up the purity of the white race. So, in all of these cases, you have interesting examples of the globalization of violence and the globalization of tension, of cultural, ethnic, religious tension and its connections with the globalized community. But it does raise a fundamental question of what religion has to do with it. And many of you say, well, nothing really. I mean, because we all know that religions teach peace. And you could argue that religion is fundamentally innocent. It's used by those nasty politicians. That maybe something else is at fault. Poverty, for example, economic difficulties. Robert Pape at the University of Chicago wrote about the displacement of persons being displaced from one's homeland as motivating force behind suicide, terrorism in general, religious violence in general. That religion was never really the cause. And there is something to that. I don't disagree with the general thrust of his argument, and yet, at the same time, these issues of tension, these incidents of tension are filled with images of religion, religious activists, religious rhetoric, religious... my conclusion is that religion is, in the interviews that I've done in the last 20 years, that religion is a factor. It may not be the cause. What is the cause? There are so many different elements that are conducive to a situation of violence. But when a situation of tension is conceived in religious terms, as I found in talking with this mullah in Baghdad who was involved in the insurgency, when I was in Baghdad in 2004, I was interviewing Muslim leaders to try to understand the Islamicization of the insurgency, why the hostility against American occupation of Iraq, understandable in itself, would take such a strident Islamic turn and be seen in a kind of jihadi framework of reference. And it seemed to me that just like the case of Joko Asahara or Timothy McVeigh or Binderwali, this image of conflict, when it seizes the imagination, it transforms the struggle. The case of Palestine, for example, in this case I'm interviewing Sheikh Yassin, the leader of the Hamas movement many years ago. In the case of Palestine, the movement was largely a secular movement until about 1990. With the first Intifada. And when a period of frustration sparked with an idea of religious activism transformed the movement and provided a whole new dimension of Palestinian resistance that has had such a stridently and difficult religious turn. So now you have the situation where Israel is happy to deal with Abbas, the secular leader, the old follower of Arafat, would have been happy to deal with old Arafat, and now they have this damn Hamas to deal with, a whole new kind of Islamic strident character to the movement. So when religion enters the scene, it transforms it. And it provides these extraordinary notions of thinking about warfare, images of cosmic war, images of a warfare that's more than ordinary warfare, ordinary struggle, images out of religious tradition, out of religious literature, out of religious mythology, the great Mahabharata and Ramayana tales in the Hindu epics, for example, the great historical struggles of the caliphs in Islam, the great warfare in Christian tradition going back to the Hebrew Bible and the struggles where God is on one side. Every religious tradition has such images that can be appropriated into images of cosmic war, an idea that is truly all-encompassing. It can give a template of understanding why good things happening, why bad things happening. It can give a sense of identity. Those people who struggle, give one a sense of purpose, a location, a role. One could be a struggle, a soldier in a struggle that's not just spiritual, but in some ways transforms the world around one. And the timelines of the struggle, of course, are vast. When I was interviewing Dr. Rantisi, the political head of the Hamas movement, and talking with him about the use of suicide bombing, or as he called it, self-martyrdom, to allow people opportunity to become martyrs in the struggle if they wanted, I pointed out, you can't win against Israel. Israel has an enormously strong military. It's just, as nasty and as horrible as these acts are, they're not going to change the situation in Israel. And he smiled and he looked at me as if he was speaking to a small child. And he said, well, maybe not in my lifetime. I said, maybe not in my children's lifetime. Maybe not in my children's lifetime, but in my children's lifetime, we might prevail. I said, because this is God's war. We can't lose. So when the timelines are eternal, then the possibility for success in the face of failure becomes an extraordinary possibility and an extraordinary achievement. And then perhaps this transformation, which is not just political but also personal, has an appeal because it is so terribly engrossing and ultimately, in some fundamental way, fun. There's no question to me that the same kind of attraction to computer games that occupies the attention and the minds of junior high school kids all over the United States. And the reason why some of the students who come to Pomona want to make sure they get high-speed connection is so they can rot 8 or 10 or 12 hours of their day playing computer games instead of doing their homework for their classes. That same, and computer games are invariably about war. Invariably about conflict, especially the ones that guys play, and guys are the main watchers and players of computer games. The guy computer games are almost invariably about war. And why not? Our culture is so filled with it. Our books are so full of it. Our movies are. Our mythology, our legendary is so full of it. It is a kind of dark side of the human imagination, this notion of seeing the world in such a radically different frame of reference, a world in which there's good and evil and right and wrong, in a kind of crystal clarity, and you actually know who the good guys are and the bad guys are, and you can find them and you can get rid of them, you can destroy them. It's an attraction to virtually everybody that I interviewed in acts of religious violence. And in a curious kind of way, this vision of the worldview between good and evil is also attractive to us after 2001, when we began to see the world in such stark cosmic terms as a war between the good guys and the bad guys and the evil versus the good. So in the image of cosmic war, terrorist acts are acts of war, and they are symbolic. They express, they show, they demonstrate a hidden war. In the case of Aum Shinrikyo, is the people I interviewed attested that after hearing about the reports of the nerve gas in the Tokyo subways, they knew that the war was at hand. They knew that Shoko Asahara's prophecies were real, because it was now about real things. It was a real world war, a world at war. And after 9/11, we all knew. We knew with such extraordinary and powerful and graphic evidence that not only were many people in the Muslim world convinced, which was undoubtedly Osama bin Laden's purpose, and Sheikh Khalid Mohammed, those who were involved in the 9/11 planning, to try to convince the Muslim world that they weren't just talking in mythical terms, but there really was an enemy, there really was a war between the forces of evil in the West, but it also persuaded many of us. And we began to see the world as a world at war. I did a study of the newspapers after 9/11, and that very day of 9/11, the word war was never used. The first reports from the newspaper were attack, hideous terrorist activity, But the word war didn't appear until the second day, and then in quotation marks. Who used that war? Well, of course, it was the president. On the second day, on September 12th, where he said, these are not just acts of terrorism, they're acts of war. And after September 12th, then suddenly we began to see the logo of the war on terror. We began to see the images of warfare and a kind of grand vision of conflict between right and wrong and good and evil. You're either with us or you're against it, and a kind of a starkly ideological confrontation that was able to embrace all kinds of other conflicts, including the war in Iraq. And as recently as the speech asking for a surge in troops, at the end of that speech and in a remarkable interview given 2 days later that was broadcast on PBS and the McNeil-Lehrer report, the president went on great lengths to say that this is an ideological confrontation. We are in a fight that's much bigger than simply difficulty in restoring and reconstructing Iraqi civil society. It's a conflict between good and evil and right and wrong. It's an ideological struggle for the future of civilization. It's a cosmic war. So from both the jihadi point of view that imagines for reasons that are reasonably sensible as well as for cosmic ones, and from the point of view of American foreign policy that also sees good reasons for wanting to assert American control and infuse democratic principles in the Middle East. But to take this frame of reference and then conceive it in cosmic terms transforms the situation and makes it extremely difficult to negotiate. It becomes then a kind of jihadi war, a war of ideas, of ideology, like the old Cold War, one that cannot easily be solved and easily be negotiated, but rather one that endures and persists until both sides become exhausted. In the announcement for this talk, it was promised that I would give some indication of how we might have done things different, how one might respond differently to provocation from religious violence. And if I'm right, if many of these acts are done out of a conviction that there's an invisible and cosmic war, it seems to me sensible to try to avoid responding in those terms, to try to avoid responding in the kind of provocative military way in which the war is proposed to us, and rather deal with them as criminal acts, to look at the underlying tensions that may lead to the imagination of war in the first place, and to certainly look down, to find the culprits, to bring them to justice, to avoid alienating the moderates, the people who might potentially be our supporters, and potentially the people who would help to identify those who were involved in such extreme acts in the first place. Much the same way as we did after Oklahoma City. The remarkable thing to me is how little Christian terrorism has occurred in this country after Oklahoma City. And I think there are several reasons for that. Part of it may be that act was so horrendous that it scared the Christian activists themselves, realize the seriousness of their imagined war. But part of it, I think, is the fact that they were, in some ways, ignored. That is, their ideology was ignored. We didn't immediately invade Idaho. The bombs didn't rain down in Montana. They were basically ignored. And the culprits, the people who were directly involved, were identified, brought to justice, and the larger movement was essentially ignored, alienated, treated in the manner that it probably should have been, as something not worthy of respect. In the case of Al-Qaeda, we identified Osama bin Laden not just as a ratty little terrorist living in some caves in Afghanistan with a few hundred activists around the world as his supporters, which undoubtedly was the case, but rather as the leader of some sort of world jihad, as some sort of new global occupational force, and thereby extraordinarily magnify his importance. Seems to me, in hindsight, a horrendous mistake. Instead, to isolate, to diminish the levels of violence rather than to extreme them, to make them more extreme. The responses become part of the problem. If I am right in thinking of cosmic war as almost a scenario of conflict, an almost theater of conflict, then we become a part of that conflict. A way in which, by we, I mean those of us who are affected by it, the countries and the populations and societies that are victimed by acts of terrorism, and the way we respond to it then becomes a part of what will happen next. And to this day, it becomes a part of what will happen next. We, in fact, hold a lot of the answers to the way in which the violence of the present forms of religious terrorism will come to a diminished end. So in conclusion, what causes terrorism? Well, you could take the metaphor of the forest fire, which I think in some ways is better than root causes or metaphors that try to identify a single problem. You could say that a lot of things conduce to create a forest fire, just like a lot of things conduce to create conflict. You know, what is the cause of forest fires? Is it the dry conditions? Is it the flammable trees? Is it the spark that starts it? Well, it has to have all of those things. And so the conditions in different parts of the world, whether they're a situation of perceived oppression or economic insecurity, are ignited sometimes by the imagination of a great conflict, the imagination of cosmic war that religious ideology often brings to a situation and helps to create an intractable conflict out of a negotiable difficulty. So it's a situation in which religion in many parts of the world plays, in one sense, a peripheral role. Is not fundamentally a part of the economic or political structure that creates the tensions that lead to a situation of anxiety and change, but can produce an enormously important tactical role in providing, in the imagination of an increasingly globalized community, the possibility of thinking in grand and global terms. So that's my presentation on religion and as a role in conflict throughout the world, but particularly in the Pacific Basin. And I thank you for your patient and kind attention. And we're willing to respond to questions.
Please, questions, comments?
A bunch of questions. One that was brought up that was quite interesting, I thought, was that Islam, more than being a religion, was more of a system of governance, controlling people.
Well, I think one of the things you're pointing to is that our way of thinking about religion is something that's kind of cut off from other parts of life and reduced to pretty much what you do on Sunday morning and what people do with their private spiritual life. This way of thinking about religion doesn't quite exist in the same way in other parts of the world, not just in the Islamic parts of the world, but Hindu parts of the world, or Confucian parts of the world, or even Christian parts of the world before the Enlightenment, where that idea that religion is one thing that's not a part of the rest of life. So in areas of the world where one thinks of religion as simply a way of thinking about the fundamentals of life, or the absolutes on which all kinds of moral and social principles are based, then yeah, it is connected with a sense of law, for example, or a sense of social order, or correct behavior within society in a way that it is in a Confucian structure, or the idea of dharma within the Hindu structure, or the idea of fiqh and law is within Islam. So I think you're onto something in thinking in those terms, but I don't think that's peculiar to Islam. I think it is a part of the way in which religion, for most of the world, before the time of the Enlightenment especially, was perceived, and which still is perceived that way in many parts of the world.
There's a big distinction today in Christianity and Judaism as opposed to Islam. Islam now wants to control the world. They want to go backward to their perceived power. And in my opinion, bring us back to the Stone Age, where they want to control both the government and the religious component.
Yeah, but I don't think most Muslims feel like that. there may be.
I don't hear too much, outcry. I don't see protests in the street. I don't see ads in the Wall Street Journals. I mean, where's the Million Muslim March? Protesting these horrific acts.
I wonder if I could...
But let me, you can come in a second, but let me respond directly to that. And that you could say the same thing about Christians responding to Timothy McVeigh. After the bombing of the world...
Responsible for Timothy McVeigh.
Pardon?
Christians are responsible for Timothy.
Well, that's exactly the way most Muslims feel about Osama bin Laden. They're not responsible for these extremists. In the case of Timothy McVeigh, he was out to try to create Christendom. He wanted to restore Christendom, and he was a wacky extremist. Most Christians had no sense of connection with Timothy McVeigh, and I think most Muslims feel the same way about Osama bin Laden, that these kind of extremists don't speak for them. If people ask them, they'll say, yeah, I have nothing to do with it. And organizations such as the Islamic Center of Southern California regularly, whenever there's an issue, an incident involving Muslims, will immediately put something out on the press release and say that we're not associated with it. So not always very well reported. But it's pretty frustrating, I think, for most Muslims to have to deal with this and have to deal with this image because they are confronted in a way that most Christians weren't, like with the Christian militia or the bombing of the abortion clinics or the bombing of the Olympic Park in Atlanta, Georgia. Nobody asked me as a Christian to try to, excuse myself from that. I wouldn't even have thought of it. Then it would approach my mind. I'd have to apologize for some wacko bombing of Olympic Park.
There's how many Muslim acts? How many Muslims acts for every Christian one that you quote and say Christian?
Acts of terrorism in the United States, Christian acts of terrorism, infinitely more than Muslim acts of terrorism. There have been scores of acts of Christian terrorism in the United States. Well, I'll start listing some. Ruby Ridge, Elohim City, the bombing of the Olympic Park, the killing of the Berg, the Jewish talk show host in Denver radio, the attack on the Jewish daycare setting in Los Angeles. Yes, acts of the Christian militia. They're all traced to the Christian identity movement, as Eric Robert Rudolph was, who's the guy who attacked the Olympic Park in Atlanta. These are acts of Christian terrorism.
But identified as Christian acts of terrorism.
You're hearing me identify them that way.
I mean, the media was certainly not, very friendly to religiosity. Certainly would have reported if it were acts of Christian terrorism.
Well, oh yes. The stories they say that they are traced to the Christian identity movement. You read the stories; they always say this. Now, you're absolutely right. They don't say a Christian terrorist strikes again.
That's what I'm saying.
Because for most of us, that's ludicrous. Because these are extremists, a part of a weird extremist little group, who the extremists think they're defending Christianity. We just think they're wackos. The same is true in Islam. Most Muslims regard Osama bin Laden exactly the same way. An extremist wacko.
Excuse me, I wonder if we can open this up. There's a few other questions.
It's a good conversation, though. I enjoy it.
It's an important conversation, and I think it reveals the perception that, and this is something I wanted to ask you as well, is there's a perception there's something about Islam that leads to religious violence. And yet I think I see you saying that it's religion in general, in many religious traditions, that can justify cosmic war and cosmic violence.
My examples are from every religious tradition.
In that regard, I wonder if you could talk about one of the Asian terrorist experience that you did not mention, and I think is the origin of the suicide bomber with the belt bomb, and that's the case of Sri Lanka, the Sinhalese Buddhist conflict there. Mm-hmm. And it's not, we generally have the image of Buddhism as being rather peaceful, and yet this is where we get the origin of suicide bombers. Is that not true? And I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yes, there were suicide bombers in Sri Lanka, more on the Tamil side, and the Tamils were Hindus and Christians, more on the Tamil sides, and the terrorists who used the suicide bomber device with the weapons around their around their stomach, like the woman who killed Rajiv Gandhi, the Prime Minister of India. She had this belt strapped underneath her sari, and so when he came in Madras to meet the crowd, she came up to bow in front of him and then blew herself up and killed him at the same time. And these things happened in the late 70s and early 80s before they happened with Hamas and before the development. That's really only in the last 15 years or so. So you're right. The acts of suicide bombing had been among the Tamils and the Christians, the Tamil Hindus and Christians in Sri Lanka. Buddhists were also involved in acts of terrorism, less suicide terrorism, but more bombings. And in some cases, Buddhist monks, which is really shocking because you think Buddhism of all religions should be peaceful. But I got to tell you, as recently as a month ago, there was a peace rally in Colombo, the capital of Sri Lanka, and it was broken up by a bunch of Buddhist monks who came to the peace rally with clubs and started clubbing the people in the peace rally, saying, "You have your peace rally when Sri Lanka is free and the Tamils are put in their place." So they were just annoyed that they would be trying to preach peace. And then the other suicide activists were the Sikhs in northern India, and they were the first ones to blow up airplanes through suicide bombings. They were the first ones to use acts of suicide bombing to attack government buildings. And the last major act of the Sikh movement in the late 1980s was in Chandigarh, where the chief minister of the state of Punjab was killed by a suicide bombing of a Sikh activist who had wrote a long confessional the night before talking about the great martyrdom tradition of Sikhism and that he was going in glory in the path of the gurus just as they have gone before him, and he blew himself up.
I'm glad you raised that because I have two more questions for you. But you started with the Sikhs, and I was hoping to bring you back because, as far as I understand, that's the only case of religious violence out of Asia, religious terrorism, religiously motivated terrorism, that has resolved itself. They didn't attain Khalistan, and yet I think the last act you mentioned was the last act of Sikh religious violence. And was there anything done right that's resolved that situation? Was there a solution, or are there any lessons learned?
The case of the Sikh movement, there are two things that brought it to an end. One was the persistent militance of the Indian government, and the fact that they were in a fairly controlled, they weren't a globalized movement, so they could be controlled by the Indian government. That was certainly one major part of the reason. The other was the movement just wore itself out. After 15 years, people in the Punjab were just sick of all the bloodshed, sick of all the fighting. The Khalistani rebels had become like local thugs. Whatever romantic and religious ideology had vanished, and they were simply terrorizing the countryside, and people were sick of it and had enough. And that was probably as strong as anything else. I think a more interesting case of the ending of terrorism is the case of Northern Ireland. Because there you really did have a long and persistent history of terrorism, of acts of violence that terrorized not only that part of Ireland but also London. Most people in this room can remember those horrible scenes of bombing in London as the Irish cause was being propelled. And here was a case, someone like Hamas, where they were Christians on both sides, Roman Catholic and Protestant, were trying to claim a piece of territory. You can say, yes, but this wasn't really religious fighting, this was over land. This is true of Hamas also. It's also over land who's going to control the area. So in many ways, the cases are interestingly similar. But in Northern Ireland, a peaceful resolution was actually created, where both parties, at least the moderates on both sides, actually sat down and tried to work out some sort of compromised agreement. It took an outsider, Senator Mitchell from the United States, to come and try to mediate the agreement. It took the moderates having to decide that they weren't going to deal with the extremists. Ian Paisley, who unfortunately is back again in Northern Irish politics, even as we speak, there are elections in Northern Ireland which he may get a sizable constituency. But they decided not to waste their time on people that would not negotiate, that would not be involved in a negotiated settlement, and they came up with a Good Friday Agreement that did lead to a peace, and it's a peace that's pretty much stayed for some years in Northern Ireland. So it is good to know that there are options in a situation of terrorism that does not require a total military obliteration on one side or the other. In fact, there are no cases that I know of in which a military objective has worked. There's no case in which responding to terrorism simply purely through a military response has destroyed the terrorism. Not a single case.
So we have 2 questions.
I was curious whether you could say that the Bonhoeffer failed attempt on Hitler's life fits into this pattern at all.
Whether Bonhoeffer?
The failed attempt that he made to murder Hitler with the briefcase with the bomb that didn't go off. Does that fit into this discussion at all?
No, it's an interesting case. In case that people don't know the story that she's telling about, it's a Christian theologian who was from Germany. And when he was at Union Theological Seminary in New York City, he realized that he didn't have the luxury of just staying here. He should go back and do something about Hitler, and particularly his treatment of the Jews. And so he got involved in a plot to assassinate Hitler. It was a plot that was discovered, and Bonhoeffer was ultimately convicted and killed. But in an interesting kind of way, it was an attempt that might have used a strategic act of violence in order to keep a larger act of violence from occurring. Is that consistent with principles of nonviolence? Well, I wrote a book on Gandhi and nonviolence, and I have to argue that Gandhi made some exceptions of absolute nonviolence. And 2 exceptions he gave were the case of the mad dog, who was biting people and you have to stop it, a case of a rapist who was caught in the act of attacking somebody, a case of a sniper on the top of a building. All of these are cases where one might use strategic acts of violence in order to keep larger acts of violence from occurring. Is this what Bonhoeffer was trying to do? Could he be regarded as being consistent with principles of nonviolence, even though he was trying to kill just one person, Hitler, rather than wage a military solution to the crisis? I don't know. It's an interesting case, and thank you for raising it.
I wanted to ask you about nationalism. It seems to me like nationalism evolved into something that we might think of as ethnic nationalism. Is it fair to think of religious nationalism now in terms of, there's going to be a pan-Islamic state somewhere in the Middle East, and that's what we're working for? Does that make sense, or is that just completely off?
No, it's a very interesting point. That many of the movements, there are a lot of different kinds of religious activist movements. There are a lot of different kinds of Islamic activist movements. Hamas, for example, that's active in Israel and Palestine, is focused on creating an Islamic state. After 9/11, when I was in Gaza and talking with members of Hamas, a number of them pulled me to the side and said, "Is Osama bin Laden? He says, what's he after anyway? What's the point of it? What's he all about?"
veneer to religion, as in how do we be critical of something without being irresponsible to the actual form of religiosity? Then Reza, on the other hand, is sort of accusing Sam of not knowing what he's talking about because he's not an Islamic specialist and all that sort of stuff. But so I'm sort of wondering.
Reza Aslan was here?
Right. Yeah. It was a debate between these two.
Right.
So,
he's a graduate student at Santa Barbara.
Right.
I'm his advisor.
Okay. So then this directly applies, and so
Yeah.
I sort of-
Obviously, I'm on Reza's side.
Okay, so but Sam was just, he was comfortable with sort of not ridiculing, but using very derogatory language and generalizations about Islam in general, as in, jihad is evident from the beginning. It's an extremist sort of religion. Muhammad was a warrior, that sort of stuff. So how do we talk about a form of Islam, like a militant Islam, without, in an academic sense, and respecting it as a form of religiosity that comes out of a certain social, economic context and stuff, without doing damage to it? Without completely discounting it, like Sam would say we do with astrologers or something. Because, he's okay with saying there are certain discourses in the world that we sort of discount or we stop listening to. So we should do the same thing for terrorists, because they're doing certain things that are totally crazy to us. So hopefully that sort of makes some sense.
No, it makes perfectly good sense. I think you talk about it in just that way. I mean, let's take another ideology, nationalism, which in the 20th century has created probably the most horrendous acts of violence, genocides, from Hitler and National Socialism to Pol Pot. The crimes that have been done in the name of nationalism are just absolutely horrendous. And the millions of people who were killed through extreme nationalism or fascism in the 20th century is much greater than any other act of killing in the name of ideology ever, and certainly much more than religious ideologies. Does that mean nationalism is a horrible idea, that we should dispense with it, that it has no virtue, that has no values? Well, I think probably not. I think most of us would say, yeah, there's some good things about nationalism after all. Not necessarily bad, but it's true. There are some extremist nuts, and we should, take them into consideration. Yes, sir.
You earlier mentioned failed business tycoons that lack qualifications.
Right. Yes, I'm afraid somebody would pick up on that.
Speaking of that case, and you mentioned sort of the decline of Christian terrorism in the U.S. after a certain point. I was wondering if you could speak to the, at least oblique and sometimes coded use of religious language in a lot of the speeches made by, our own administration in reference to either global war on terror or this ideological struggle, where it's maybe this Christian identity, this Christian struggle for Christian civilization is no longer internalized, but now it's externalized. Anything for that?
Well, I agree with your point, your implicit point, that is, it is a problem. This kind of rhetoric of cosmic war problematizes a situation that otherwise it might have been handled differently or have been negotiated differently. When you put a situation of conflict or tension into when you put a situation of conflict or tension into a we, they, either or kind of contestation, it makes it extremely difficult to negotiate out of in any moderate means, and opens up, of course, the venue for a military solution, or a presumed military solution is the only possible one. And yet, of course, in these kind of confrontations, there can never really be an ideological confrontation. You can never have a military solution. There wasn't one in the case of the Cold War, and there certainly wouldn't be in the case of what has been called the war on terrorism, where there is an ideological contestation of differences. It's rather a matter of then how to manage a way of dealing with people who are different, but more importantly, trying to moderate against extremes and get the great bulk, and thank God there are such rational people on this planet, is simply dealing with each other in a reasonable way.
In sticking with your metaphor, I think, in some regards, as long as we're able to keep the forest fire in somebody else's backyard, how does it peter out within our own context? I mean, I think besides the extreme religious cases where the religious violence just people get sick of it.
Well, midterm elections have helped. Yeah, Yes, but even within the executive branch of the government, there have been really some rather significant changes. I mean, some of the most intractable stands seem to be not so intractable after all. Yeah, in the case of North Korea, for example, we were only going to have 6-party talks, and then it turned out that we did have 2-party talks in order to plan for the 6-party talks. That was good enough for the North Koreans, and now we're able to get some sort of a deal worked out with the North Koreans. This Saturday, there will be a meeting in Baghdad, orchestrated by the al-Maliki government. They've invited Iran, and they've invited Syria, and oh, by the way, they invited representatives from the United States. Now, the United States has said it's never going to negotiate with Iran, but yeah, it'll show up there, and yeah, they might happen to run into some of these people on the way to the men's room or something, and they might just talk to them. Who knows? So, there is actually a conversation, and this is extraordinary. I mean, this is really, I think, to many people who read the Baker-Hamilton report and thought that we really had a way out. There was a sensible path here to follow, and the first part of that was to negotiate with your enemies, to start talking with Syria and Iran, and bring Saudi Arabia into the discussion. There has been now a discussion between Iran and Saudi Arabia just 2 weeks ago, and now this conversation that will occur on Saturday, I think, is a very positive step. Is this Condoleezza Rice? Is it this absence of Rumsfeld? Is this, Cheney is busy, shooting fellow bird? But I don't know what the reason for it is, but it's a good step.
Well, I think on that note, we have one student back.
Right.
Last question, I think.
Tony Blair has tried to kind of to redefine this debate, at least in the mainstream context. Instead of referring to this as a clash between civilization, I'm in religious term, he likes to call it, or he's trying to call it a clash about civilization. I guess it's like the way he advocates is that we should be empowering the moderates, throughout the various religions of the world, particularly he's talking about Islam, I guess. And through that way, we need to stand up and we need Muslims in America to stand up and say, hey, last I checked, I'm free to practice my religion here, So there's things that, Islamic militants are saying about the West just frankly aren't true. And so this is, it's a debate about civilization, about how we can live, and our values. I just wanted to what if you think that is a way that we should be approaching the problem?
Sure. I think that's a step forward in the right direction, and characterizing it that way is a very sensible approach indeed. And again, I refer you to the Baker-Hamilton report, which says something of the same thing, that we should be looking at this, particularly the issue in Iraq, not an ideological framework, but rather in practical terms of how to provide a